Okay, so notice that there's a problem with these two controllers, right? Is that this data is being replicated in both places, right? In the login controller and in the profile controller, right? And we can't have that redundancy, right? Instead, this data needs to live in one single place. There has to be a singleton, right? Instance where this data lives, or at least where we can always retrieve and manipulate the data in a consistent place in one single place of maintenance. All right, so let's do that. In Angular, the way to do that is to encapsulate your data through a service, right? A centralized singleton service that gives you a predetermined API for access, right? That's a single place where you can access and update and manipulate the data, right? So let's do that. So what we're going to do is that we're going to move this into a service. And let's create our very first service. So let's go into public, and let's go down to assignment, graduate, and we'll create here a brand new directory where we're going to put all our services, right? So services. And our very first service is going to be the user service. And there it is. It's going to be user.service.client.js. Next week, we're going to have a sister to this that's going to be a mirror image on the server, right? This week, we're just going to have it on the client, right? So this is going to be user service client.js. Next week, we're going to add a user service server.js, right? That's going to run on the server. So, okay? And they're going to be talking to one another, exchanging the data. But for this week, we're only going to have the data live here, okay? So let's create it, right? Again, like all our JavaScript that runs on the client, on the browser, we're going to wrap it inside of an iffy expression. We're going to use Angular to load our module, right? The WAM module, and we're going to declare a service, right? Now there are two ways that are acceptable ways of declaring a service. One of them is to use the factory decorator, right? This, what it does is that it creates a it uses the factory design pattern, right? And the factory design pattern says that there are some objects. Typically, when you want to create an instance of something, you use the keyword new, and then the class name, and it gets instantiated, and you get a new instance. Yes. Now, sometimes the creating a new instance is fairly involved, right? Sometimes, not always. And there's a design pattern called the factor design pattern that says if an object is fairly complex to create an instance, meaning you have a constructor, but the parameters that you would have to pass are so complex that you have to fetch this and query this and update that and whatever before you get all the dependencies, and then you can pass it into a constructor. Ideally, what you would do is that you invert the responsibility. Instead of the person who's instantiating it having to fetch all these things, encapsulate all that logic, right, into a function, right, that does all those things, and then it instantiates it for you. So encapsulate all that logic for creating instances, right? So that's what the factory pattern allows you to do, right? And the way it works is that you give it a name, okay, and you give it a function that it is going to allow you to encapsulate all the logic to do that, right? And the way we're going to do it is that we're going to have a lot of behaviors in here, and then we're going to return an object that has hooks into that behavior that lives in here, right? It's going to create a single instance, right, that can be used everywhere, right, across our application through the use of this service, right? It's going to be a single point of access to the data. So let's go fetch all that data. We don't want it here. We don't want it here, so I'm going to comment it out. Instead, it's going to live here, right? And eventually, this is going to live on the server, right? For this week, it's going to live here. Next week, we're going to move it to a server. And then finally, we'll put it in the database, right? But for now, it's making its way to where it belongs, right? All right, so it's here, and what we're going to do is going to create an API that will allow us to manipulate this data structure, right? For now, the only operation that we're using is this find by user ID. This find user by ID actually is a perfect thing that we would want to live here, right? You have a collection of data. Find me an instance that matches a particular criteria. Yes, right? And we want to make it available to the rest of the world who can use this service. So we're going to create an API, which is going to be a map, right? That's going to map all the behaviors that are in here, right? This is our logic for creating or instantiating the object, right? There it is. In JavaScript, instantiating an object is trivial, right? You can use a little curly bracket, and boom, you have an object that has these attributes and bound to these values, right? And there it is. That's the object, and that's what this returns. It returns this object instance that has attributes find user by ID, which are bound to these find user by ID, right? So now, because this is referred to this as a factory, this is accessible from anywhere by another design pattern that Angular copied from the big boys, is the inversion of control, or being able to inject behavior just by referring to it. Right? Just like this location and these route parameters magically made their way here, right? We can do exactly the same thing. Just the way they did it, right? Being injected here by the framework, right? We can inject ourselves here as well. Right? We are now having the same exact powers that these services have. We can now make use of this, right? So we can now remove the function in there. We don't need it anymore here, right? We can use it right here. Dot find user by ID. Okay.
So doesn't need $sign.
So $sign are services that we know are implemented by the framework, right? So we can distinguish, like a naming a namespace, right? If it starts with $sign, it's a variable or service or provider that was created by the underlying framework, right? That you don't have to create yourself. This one we created ourselves, right? The last piece is that server we just created needs to be declared as an index. So let's declare that. So script source services, and we have user service. There it is. There it is. Why are you not closing? Okay. And if we go back and we refresh, notice that it works exactly the way it worked earlier, right? So what this allows us to do is to remove any need for the controller to actually hold any data. That is not the controller's responsibility. The controller's responsibility is to listen for incoming events, right? And then delegating the action to a service or some business object, right? The business object does its magic and manipulates the model. It then responds with a new model, and then the controller sends it over to the view for rendering, right? It is not the controller's responsibility to actually touch the model, right? It knows who to delegate it to. In this case, it's delegating it to a service. The service says, hey, find me this data. I don't know how, right? If you have to go to the database, to the server, go fetch me this, right? And the service encapsulates this, right? So this service now is also available in the logging controller. We can use the same service, right? And we can encapsulate this logic here. We don't need this here anymore, right? We don't need this user because the service has that, right? And this logic here of finding a user by credentials, we can encapsulate that there as well on the service. We can remove this from here, right, and put it in where it should go in the service, and put it in a function right here and say function, find by credentials, I can't spell, Credencials. English is not my mother tongue. Username, password. And here it is, right? var, I'm going to iterate over the users, looking for username and password, which are passed around, right? And if I find it, I'm going to return user sub u, or just user. If I find it, just return user. Or if I reach the end of the loop, I'm just going to return null. Yes? Right? On the controller now, I should be able to just say found, right? Found is equal to the user service dot find user. What was it? Find. This should be find user by credentials and register in the API. Okay, and we can now say find user by credentials, and we can pass it username, username, and okay, and password. Okay, and we can refresh this. Let's go back to the login page. Let's refresh the login page, and let's see. Okay, that works. Okay, and Bob login works just like we did earlier, right? Looks exactly the same way, but we have divvied up all the responsibilities, right? We have encapsulated all data retrieval, creation. We'll do on Wednesday, right? All data manipulation is encapsulated in a service where it should be, right? And we're going to be doing the same thing for each one of the entities, right? For the websites, for the pages, for the widgets, all of them will have their own services, right? There are controllers for each one of the pages, and so we'll be adding this as we go. All right? Any questions? Does it make sense? We'll practice it again on Wednesday together, right? And you'll have a chance to practice it on your own on the assignment. Okay? All right. Thank you.